In just 8 years, one man managed to oversee the destruction of one of Europe's most prosperous middle classes. Emmanuel Macron, the youngest president in French history, the investment banker who promised to modernize France, presided over an economic catastrophe that added over $1 trillion to the national debt, drove thousands of wealthy citizens out of the country, and created a phenomenon so devastating it has its own name: Smicardization, where even educated professionals now earn barely above minimum wage. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand how Macron's policies sparked France's most violent protests in decades, cost the economy billions in damage, and created a brain drain that's bleeding the country of its brightest minds. We're talking about $2 billion lost to shopping centers in just 5 weeks of protests, 10,000 millionaires fleeing the country, and a middle class that's quietly evaporating, while the richest 0.1% of French people now earn 167 times more than the poorest quarter. This is the story of how Emmanuel Macron destroyed France's middle class, and why the $3 trillion bill is coming due. But before we dive into this financial disaster, if you're interested in the economic stories you slept through, the ones that shaped our world while most people weren't paying attention, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss these stories. Chapter 1. The President of the Rich. When Emmanuel Macron swept into the Élysée Palace in May 2017 at just 39 years old, he promised to be different. A former Rothschild investment banker with no prior elected experience, Macron marketed himself as neither left nor right, but a pragmatic centrist who would drag France into the modern economy. The French middle class, tired of stagnant growth and high unemployment, gave him a chance. But within months, Macron revealed his true priorities. In 2017, one of his first major acts was abolishing the wealth tax, the Impôt de Solidarité sur la Fortune, or ISF, that had existed in various forms since 1982. This tax targeted France's wealthiest citizens, those with assets over $1.3 million. Macron replaced it with a much narrower real estate wealth tax, effectively giving the ultra-rich a massive tax break on their financial assets. The justification? Macron's government claimed the wealth tax was driving rich people out of France. They pointed to approximately 10,000 wealthy individuals who had left France over the previous decade to avoid paying the tax, taking an estimated $35 billion in capital with them. Macron promised that abolishing it would make France more attractive to entrepreneurs and investors, spurring economic growth that would benefit everyone. The French press immediately labeled him le président des riches, the president of the rich, and the numbers proved them right. By 2020, studies showed that the incomes of the wealthiest 0.1% of French people had sharply increased. We're talking about approximately 3,800 households whose wealth exploded after the tax reform. Meanwhile, inequality in France reached levels not seen in decades. By 2025, data revealed that the wealthiest 0.1% of French people earned, on average, 167 times more than the quarter of households with the lowest incomes. But Macron wasn't done. He also slashed the corporate tax rate from 33% to 25% between 2017 and 2022, arguing this would make French businesses more competitive and create jobs. He cut taxes on capital gains. He reformed labor laws to make it easier for companies to hire and fire workers. In theory, this was classic supply-side economics. Cut taxes for the wealthy and businesses, and prosperity will trickle down to everyone else. In practice, it was a disaster for France's middle class. While the rich got richer, ordinary French workers saw their purchasing power stagnate or decline. The corporate tax cuts and labor reforms didn't create the promised jobs boom. Instead, they accelerated a phenomenon that would define Macron's presidency and devastate France's middle class: Smicardization. And that's where our story really begins. Chapter 2. Smicardization strikes. Smicardization. It's a term you won't find in economics textbooks, but every French worker knows exactly what it means. SMIC stands for Salaire Minimum Interprofessionnel de Croissance, France's minimum wage. As of November 2024, it sits at $11.88 per hour, which translates to a gross monthly salary of $1,880 or about $126 net after taxes for a 35-hour work week. Here's where it gets horrifying. Smicardization refers to the phenomenon where more and more French workers, including educated professionals with university degrees, find themselves earning wages that are at or barely above the minimum wage. Wages across the economy have stagnated so badly that they're catching up to the SMIC from below. Think about that. You go to university, earn a degree, land a professional job, and discover you're making barely more than someone flipping burgers. By 2025, millions of French workers had been smicardized. Workers in retail, hospitality, healthcare, education, sectors that once provided comfortable middle-class incomes, now found themselves trapped at minimum wage. Even in the industrial sector, unskilled workers earned an average of just $100 to $400 net per month, barely above the SMIC. The economic data tells the devastating story. Real wages in France in the first quarter of 2025 were still 1% lower than they had been in early 2021. That means French workers had actually lost purchasing power over a 4-year period, even as inflation drove up the cost of groceries, rent, utilities, and everything else. Meanwhile, wage growth slowed to just 2% annually by late 2025, barely keeping pace with inflation, meaning workers weren't getting ahead, they were just treading water. The Observatory of French Inequalities defined the middle class as single people earning between $1,683 and $3,199 net per month. But here's the problem. When millions of workers are stuck at $1,126 per month on the SMIC, they're not even in the middle class anymore. They've fallen out of it entirely. And those who managed to cling to the bottom rung of middle class status found themselves slipping backward, unable to save, unable to invest in their futures, unable to provide the life for their children that their parents had provided for them. For every $3,000 French workers earned, they saw just $1,100 after taxes. France's tax burden, among the highest in the developed world, meant that middle-class workers were crushed between stagnant wages and relentless taxation. And when Macron tried to squeeze them even harder with a fuel tax increase in late 2018, the middle class finally snapped. Chapter 3. The $2 billion riot. November 17, 2018. That's when the Yellow Vest movement, the Gilets jaunes, exploded onto the streets of France. Named after the high-visibility yellow safety vests that all French motorists are required to keep in their cars, the movement started with a simple protest against a proposed fuel tax increase. Macron wanted to raise taxes on diesel and gasoline as part of an environmental policy to combat climate change. But this wasn't about the environment. This was the last straw for a middle class that had been systematically squeezed by Macron's policies. Here was a president who had given massive tax breaks to the ultra-wealthy, who had overseen the Smicardization of the workforce, who had cut social benefits, and now he wanted to raise taxes on the very people who were already struggling to make ends meet. Rural and suburban workers who had long commutes and depended on their cars to get to work would be hit the hardest. The protest turned violent almost immediately. In Paris, the Arc de Triomphe was vandalized. The Champs-Élysées turned into a war zone. Riot police deployed tear gas and water cannons as protesters set fires, smashed windows, and battled security forces. Similar scenes played out across France, in Marseille, Lyon, Bordeaux, Toulouse. For weeks, every Saturday brought fresh chaos. The economic damage was catastrophic. In the first 5 weeks alone, the Yellow Vest protests cost French shopping centers $2 billion. That's billion with a B. Trucking federations reported operating losses of $400 million due to highway blockades and toll station disruptions. The French government estimated the protests shaved 0.1% off GDP growth in the fourth quarter of 2018. Small businesses were devastated. Tourism plummeted as international visitors cancelled trips to France, terrified of being caught in the violence. On December 10, 2018, Macron finally broke his silence. In a televised address to the nation, he announced concessions: a $100 increase to the minimum wage, tax cuts for pensioners, the cancellation of the fuel tax increase. But the damage, both physical and political, had been done. Macron's approval ratings had collapsed. The president of the rich label had been permanently seared into his reputation. More importantly, the Yellow Vest movement exposed the fundamental economic reality of Macron's France. The middle class was being destroyed. The protests weren't really about fuel taxes. They were about economic survival. They were about a system that rewarded the wealthy while crushing ordinary workers. They were about a president who seemed utterly disconnected from the daily struggles of regular French people. But if the Yellow Vests were Macron's first economic rebellion, the pension crisis of 2023 would be his second, and far worse. Chapter 4. The Pension Betrayal. By 2023, France's pension system was in crisis. The system, which guaranteed generous retirement benefits to French workers, was running massive deficits. Demographics told the brutal story. France had too many retirees and not enough workers paying into the system. The retirement age in France was 62, one of the lowest in Europe, and with life expectancy rising, people were spending decades in retirement. Macron had tried to reform the pension system in 2019, but those plans had been derailed by strikes and then by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, in 2023, he decided to force through the reform that French workers feared most, raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. On January 19, 2023, over 1 million people took to the streets in nationwide protests. It was one of the largest demonstrations in French history. Trains stopped running, schools shut down, electricity workers cut power to parts of the grid in protest. Garbage piled up on the streets of Paris as sanitation workers went on strike. Week after week, the protests continued. The CGT labor union, France's largest organized strike after strike, bringing the French economy to a grinding halt. Macron refused to back down. On March 16, 2023, his government invoked Article 49.3 of the French Constitution, a controversial provision that allowed the government to force legislation through parliament without a vote. It was the ultimate middle finger to French democracy and to the millions of workers protesting in the streets. The protest turned violent. Riot police clashed with demonstrators. The Bordeaux City Hall was set on fire. Across France, businesses were vandalized and public property was destroyed. The economic impact, while harder to quantify than the Yellow Vest protests, was significant. The French government downplayed the losses, but economists estimated the strikes cost hundreds of millions of euros in lost productivity, damaged infrastructure, and reduced economic activity. But the real damage wasn't measured in euros, it was measured in trust. The pension reform battle revealed that Macron's government was willing to override democratic processes and public opinion to push through policies that hurt ordinary workers. French workers who had spent their entire careers paying into the pension system were now being told they'd have to work 2 extra years before they could retire. The pension system itself was labeled a Ponzi scheme by critics, a system where current workers' contributions paid for current retirees' benefits rather than funding their own future pensions. With the French birth rate declining and the population aging, the math simply didn't work anymore. But instead of fundamentally reforming the system or finding new revenue sources, Macron chose the path that hurt workers most, making them work longer. And as the pension crisis raged, another crisis was quietly devastating France's economic future: the brain drain. Chapter 5. The $35 billion brain drain. Here's a question. If you're a talented young French graduate with skills in technology, finance, medicine, or engineering, why would you stay in France? You'd face a top income tax rate of 45%, one of the highest in the developed world. You'd be Smicardized, earning wages barely above minimum wage despite your education. You'd see wealthy individuals and corporations getting tax breaks while you carried the burden. You'd face a stagnant economy with limited job opportunities. Or you could leave. You could go to the United States, where tech workers earn double or triple what they'd make in France. You could go to Switzerland, where taxes are lower and salaries are higher. You could go to Germany, the UK, Canada, anywhere that offered better opportunities and didn't squeeze you dry. Thousands of France's brightest minds made that choice. The brain drain that had started in the 2000s and 2010s accelerated dramatically under Macron. Before Macron abolished the wealth tax in 2017, at least 10,000 wealthy individuals had already left France, taking an estimated $35 billion in capital with them. One study from 2006 estimated that 843 people leaving France that year alone resulted in a net loss of $2.8 billion to the French economy. But it wasn't just the wealthy leaving, it was young professionals, graduates from France's elite Grande École, schools like Sciences Po, HEC Paris, École Polytechnique increasingly looked abroad for opportunities. French engineers joined Silicon Valley tech companies. French doctors moved to Switzerland or Germany, where they could earn significantly more. French financial professionals flocked to London before Brexit, then to Frankfurt and Amsterdam afterward. The economic impact of this brain drain is staggering. When highly educated workers leave, France loses not just their tax contributions, but their entrepreneurial potential, their innovation, their ability to create jobs and drive economic growth. Every French engineer who joins Google or Microsoft instead of starting a company in France is a loss to the French economy. Every French researcher who moves to an American or Swiss university is knowledge and talent that France invested in educating but will never benefit from. By 2025, the brain drain showed no signs of stopping. If anything, it was accelerating. Young French people looked at the Smicardization of their economy, the $3 trillion national debt, the dysfunctional political system, the endless protests, and they made the rational choice: leave. France was hemorrhaging human capital. The country's best and brightest were voting with their feet, choosing opportunity over loyalty, choosing prosperity over patriotism. And with every departure, France's economic future grew dimmer. A nation cannot prosper when its most talented citizens are fleeing. And as the talent fled, the French state's ability to provide basic public services began to collapse under the weight of its $3 trillion debt. Chapter 6. The $3 trillion reckoning. Let's talk about the number that defines Macron's economic legacy. $3 trillion. That's France's total public debt. As of 2025, 3,000 billion euros. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire French economy produces in a year. France's debt to GDP ratio hit 112% in 2024, making France the 11th most indebted country in the world relative to its economic size. Emmanuel Macron alone added more than $1 trillion to France's national debt since taking office in 2017. Some of that was due to COVID-19 pandemic spending. Emergency measures to keep the economy afloat during lockdowns were necessary and added hundreds of billions in debt. But much of it came from Macron's policy choices: tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations that reduced government revenue, continued deficit spending, and a failure to meaningfully reform France's bloated public sector. By 2025, France's budget deficit reached 168.6 billion, 5.8% of economic output, nearly double the 3% limit that European Union rules require. France was in systematic violation of EU fiscal rules, and the country's finances were spiraling out of control. The Banque de France projected GDP growth of just 0.7% for 2025, anemic growth that would make it impossible to grow out of the debt crisis. The $3 trillion debt has real consequences for ordinary French people. First, it means less money for public services, healthcare, education, infrastructure, all deteriorating as the French government is forced to cut spending to try to get the deficit under control. Second, it means higher taxes. The middle class, already crushed by some of the highest tax rates in the developed world, faces the prospect of even more taxation to service the debt. Third, it means economic stagnation. When a government is spending huge portions of its budget just paying interest on debt, it can't invest in growth. Perhaps most ominously, France's debt crisis threatens the entire Eurozone. France is the Eurozone's second largest economy after Germany. If France faces a debt crisis, if investors lose confidence in France's ability to repay its debts, it could trigger a broader European financial crisis, potentially worse than the Greek debt crisis of the 2010s. The stakes aren't just French, they're continental. And what does France have to show for this $3 trillion in debt? A Smicardized workforce earning minimum wage, a brain drain bleeding the country of talent, public services collapsing under fiscal pressure, violent protests erupting every few years as workers fight back against policies that crush them, a middle class that has been systematically destroyed, falling out of the economic security their parents enjoyed and into precarity and poverty. Emmanuel Macron promised to modernize France. Instead, he presided over the destruction of France's middle class and saddled the country with a debt burden that will take generations to overcome, if it can be overcome at all. If stories like this fascinate you, where we uncover the economic events that shaped our world while most people weren't paying attention, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we're just getting started with these financial, educational mysteries.